This is a follow-up of the previous tutorial which I made on how to make a simple menu with Godot. And in this one, I will show you how to make a loading screen. This method will use threads in order to run the loading function in the background, so it won't cause your device to freeze. So with that, let us get to the tutorial. So I'll just come over here to my editor and add a new scene. This will be a user interface node with a panel container inside it for the background, and then I can just make it full screen. Then I can add in a center container with a label inside it, and the function of the label will be basically to display the percentage. So I can just give it a default text of like 0%. Then I can come back here to my center container and then make it full screen. Then for my label, I'll just go over here to theme overrides, go to font sizes, and then I'll just make it something like 50 pixels so that it becomes larger. So you can use a texture progress for displaying the percentage or a fancy animation, but for this tutorial I'll just use a simple label because that will take up too much time. So I can just also come here to my root node and call it load screen. Then I can save my scene and we can start scripting. So I'll attach a script to my node over here. Then I'll create 3 variables. So for this one, we will not be removing the default text because we are going to be using both of them. So I'll create a variable called next scene, and it will be a string which will hold the path of the next scene which we will want to be loading. Then I will create a variable called progress, and this will be an array, and this will hold the percentage of the next scene which has been loaded. So it will be a number ranging from 00 all the way to 0.1, or not 0.1 to 1.0 I mean. So 0.0 basically means the scene has just started loading, 0.5 means it's halfway done loading, and 1.0 means it's fully loaded. So this is basically what we'll be using to tell the percentage of the scene which has been loaded. Then we can create another variable called load status, which will be equal to an integer. So currently it's 0. If this integer is 1, it means the scene is still loading. 2 means it has failed loading, and 3 means its loading was done and it's fully loaded and done. So currently it will be 0, and I'll show you how to use all of these variables in a few. So the first thing we want to do is when the scene loaded, so when this scene enters our tree, we are just going to say resource loader. So resource loader dot load threaded request, and then we are going to request our next scene. So this is basically all you need to do to load your next scene and to do it in the background, because you can see that this is a threaded request, so it will run in a different thread of your device. So it will not cause your device to freeze no matter how large the next scene that is loading is. So once we are loading the next scene, we can come over here to our process function, and this function runs every frame of your device. So if your device maybe has like a frame rate of 60 FPS, it is going to run this function. This function is going to be run 60 times a second. So every process, we want to check the load status of our scene. So if it's done loading, and we want to check how much percentage of it has finished loading, so we are going to say load status is equal to our resource loader dot load threaded get status, and then we're going to pass in the next scene, so the path to the next scene which we are loading, and we are also going to pass in our progress variable. So this function will basically return the integers which I was telling you about. So it's going to give us 0, 1, 2, or 3 to tell us whether the scene has finished loading, or if it has failed, or if it is currently still loading. Then the final argument we've given it over here, so it's what it will do is it will say it will pass the percentage which has been loaded. So this is going to give us our 0.1 or our 0.0 or our 0.5 or our 1.0. So this one will basically tell us the progress which has been loaded, or the percentage which has been loaded. So now for every process we can do something like this. So we can say that our label dot text is equal to the string of our progress, so this variable over here. And then we have to remember that it's an array, so we want to get the 0th item in this array because it's just it's basically an array. So we want to get the 0th item, which will be the current progress, and then we can just multiply this by 100 to make it into a percentage. Then we can just say plus the percentage function, and this will basically show us the percentage of the scene which has been loaded. So now we can just say if our load status is equal to 0 or is equal to 1, 2 or 3. So if we want to check if our scene has finished being loaded, we can say if our load status is equal to 3, then do something. But if you don't want to remember these digits, you can just say resource loader dot load dot thread load to thread loaded. So this is basically a constant for the resource loader object. So if we just hold Control or Command and click it, we can see that these are like constants which basically hold those values. So 3 is the thread has finished being loaded successfully, and 2 means it's failed loading, 1 means it's in progress, and 0 means that the resource you are loading does not exist. So if you don't want to remember all of those values, you can just say resource loaded or thread load loaded. So, and this will basically tell you, will basically give you those integers. So if our scene has finished loading, what you want to do is to create a variable called scene. So this will hold our scene, and then this one will be equal to our resource loader dot load threaded get, and then we're going to pass in our next scene. So this will basically return the scene that has finished being loaded, and then it's going to store it in this variable, which we can now say get tree dot change scene to packed. So we are going to pass in our packed scene, and this will be the scene we just loaded. So this is basically how you load a scene in the background and create a progress bar or a loading screen to show its progress. So if we run our scene, we are going to see our percentage over here. Oh, and there's an issue. So I'll just close my scene and go over here to the debugger, and it's going to say, so we didn't pass in a scene which we're going to load. So we can just say resources / like our level dot tscn. So that's basically this level scene that we made, that we were using in the previous tutorial. So this one over here. So I didn't pass in a scene which I was going to load. That's why it brought up an error. So now if we run our scene, it should work. So yeah, it worked, but we didn't see anything, and that's because this scene is too tiny for us to load like for a long time. So what we can do to maybe like delay the progress so we can see is we can create something like a timer, and then we can say we can connect its timeout signal to our node. So timer dot on timeout. Then we can just copy our scene or function for loading the scene over to our timeout function or to our timeout signal. So basically what we want to do here is to say if the scene has finished loading, we are going to start our timer. So timer dot start, and then you can say something like maybe 2 seconds. So this is basically how you will also be putting your animations for when the scene has finished loading. So if our scene has finished loading, we start the timer, and after the timer has stopped is when we change our scene. Also, one thing you'll notice that this function runs every frame, so it was going to check if the resource has finished loading, and then it's going to be starting the timer multiple times, so it won't run, or the timer won't ever time out because it will be starting every time. So what we want to do is to also check if the timer is running. So if timer is stopped, so if the timer is not running is when we want to start it, but if it's running, we don't want to start it again because that will cause it to never time out. So if our timer is not running, we want to start it. So now if we load our scene, we can see that it basically loaded very quickly, and then it reached 100%, and then it switched us to our next scene. So if you have a larger scene, you're going to see it progress all the way from 0% to 100%. But because our scene is very tiny, it won't work. So now I can show you how to actually attach that to our script. So we can go over here to our main menu scene. Then instead of changing our scene directly to the level scene when we click it, so right now when we press start, it just switches us to our next scene automatically. But we want to switch to our loading screen so that our scenes can finish loading and stuff, so that we can actually move to the next scene. So for that, I'll just come here to my onStartPressed function. So I showed you what this did in the previous tutorial. So instead of changing my scene directly, I'm going to say var loading screen. So load screen is equal to preload. So we're going to load our load screen scene. So preload, and then I'm going to pass in the path to my load screen. Then I'm going to change my load screen. Oh, we're also supposed to instantiate the scene, so load screen.instantiate, so that we can actually use it. Then I can just remove this function over here. Then if you want to change the scene which your load screen will load to next, I can just say load screen.next scene. So you remember this variable over here in our load screen. So I can change it to the path which I want to load, but for this case it will be the same as the original scene. So I can say level.tscn. So resources level.tscn, and then once my loaded screen has been loaded, I can just say my add child. So I can just add it to my current scene, so add child, and then I'm going to add in my load screen. Then if I run my scene and I press start, you can see that it loaded, then it switched me to the next scene. I can also do that for this back button. So if I go to my level scene, then I check my script over here, which I had already. So instead of turning the scene to the main menu directly, I can just copy this over here. Then I can paste it to my scene. Okay, I did something wrong, so I can just paste it to my scene. And then I can change the next scene from being level.tscn to my main menu.tscn. Or you can just, instead of typing this manually, you can just like left click it on the file system over here, and then you can just copy its path. Then you can just paste it. So you just press Ctrl V and paste it. And then if I run my level scene and I press the back button, oh, so there was something wrong. So in my level scene, if you remember in the previous tutorial, I put all of the control items in a canvas layer. You can go back to the previous tutorial in which I explained all of this. So I will want to put my load screen in canvas layer 2, because that is where all my control nodes are. So I can just say, instead of adding it directly to the level, I can say canvas layer 2 / control dot add child. So I'm just going to be adding it to this canvas layer instead of directly to the scene. Then once I run it, it should work perfectly fine. So back, we can see it's loading. Then it will switch us to our game title. So that's basically how you make a loading screen with Godot.